Hello and welcome. Our show tonight is a bit different from many of the Mary Hanson shows. It's a topic, though, that I've been interested in a long time, and one that I'm excited about exploring with my guest tonight and learning from him. We're going to talk about the ecological restoration of the Minnesota River Basin. And my guest is Richard Currie Smith, who has written his dissertation on this topic. He's done it in a most creative way using some of the thinking of the anthropologist Gregory Bateson. And we'll talk about Bateson in a minute. But in reading about this big topic, I read this quote, and I think it kind of sets the stage. Ecosystems are self-corrective, so man has been responsible for the environmental destruction, degradation that we have on our planet. Rich has some very exciting ideas and research going on with the Minnesota River. So welcome, Rich.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. I want to start out talking just some basic questions for those who maybe are not good in geography or haven't traveled in Minnesota a lot. The Minnesota River is kind of the stepsister to the Mississippi, isn't it? Doesn't get as much attention, and yet it certainly is a hugely important river. You just told me it originates in Big Stone Lake.
Yeah, the Minnesota River, first of all, it is the namesake river of Minnesota, and Minnesota comes from the Dakota term for cloudy river. And we always think of Minnesota as the land of sky blue waters. Well, Minnesota means cloudy water. And the Minnesota River starts in Big Stone Lake, and it runs like a check mark through the state. And Big Stone is on the far western side of the state.
Right.
If you were to be in Minneapolis and go straight west and run out of Minnesota, then you'd be at Big Stone Lake. And that's where the Minnesota River starts. It goes like a check down through the state, down to Mankato, and then on up to the Twin Cities and meets in a confluence with the Mississippi.
And where it meets is within striking distance here, right, at Pike Island, right?
And Pike Island is a very unique place. It is one of these sacred sites, if not the most sacred site for Dakota, who lived here when the people first came, the settlers first came. It was seen as them as the group that controlled that spot was basically in charge of the universe. It was the spot closest to heaven and closest to the center of the earth. And that confluence, and that's where Fort Snelling State Park is, and Fort Snelling, right there at the present time. And the Minnesota River is also unique in that the valley around it is a very unique valley. What I usually tell people if they want to understand the Minnesota River and the valley is to, well, have you been to the Mega Mall?
Yes.
Okay. A lot of folks have been to the Mega Mall.
Try not to go too often.
Yes, a lot of folks have been to the Mega Mall. The Mega Mall, if you go south on Cedar towards Burnsville, you'll be, and if you, just when you start hitting the valley, you'll look off and you'll see trees and you'll see a little bit of a river down there. And on the far reach of that, over about 3 miles over, you'll go to the banks on the other side. Well, this is an uplift valley. That river could never have carved that valley. Something very unique happened to create that river. And that was a cataclysmic geological event.
And how long ago?
About 12,000 years ago.
12,000.
It was when the glaciers receded. The last glacier receding occurred about 12,000 years ago. This area was covered in ice, and southern Minnesota was covered in ice, and into Iowa. And the glaciers receded, and their receding left the land of 10,000 lakes. That's how we got this land of 10,000 lakes, was the receding of the glaciers left these glacial lakes.
These holes. And so the river valley was carved out by a glacier too.
Well, what happened was a very unique event. Glacial Lake Agassiz was formed in the retreating of these glaciers. And this was at this time the largest inland lake in the world. Bigger than all the Great Lakes combined. It was in northern Minnesota, went into South Dakota, North Dakota, and up into Canada. And then what happened was a land bridge down at the bottom of the lake on the far southwestern side of this lake at Big Stone Lake, broke, and a cataclysmic occurrence happened. A torrent of water came down this valley, which we now know as the Minnesota River Valley.
And that's what caused the
Carved it to
the
bedrock
big
in many
3 mile.
places. Bigger than the Amazon in many places. This is one of the biggest river valleys in the world.
And that's something that most Minnesotans don't know.
No, and it has many implications in terms of how people live now. There's a creek in Eden Prairie called Purgatory Creek. Okay, so it's not meandered down this little stream creek. It's because it's fast. It's velocity, the velocity of water, and that causes erosion. That's one of the components in why the Minnesota River is cloudy. It's a cloudy river because the glacial till that was left erodes very easily. But also the velocity of the water coming down from this large drop, sometimes 300 feet, and this velocity of water then takes this loose soil and goes into the water and creates a cloudy river. And that's where the Minnesota cloudy river.
Now, it's also clouded, though, because of pollution, right? From farmlands and small factories.
Minnesota River, 10 years ago when I started my original research, and I was part of a National Science Foundation Environmental Protection Agency study of the Minnesota River. And when we started it, American Rivers said it was one of the 20 most polluted rivers in the nation.
Really?
And this was coming mainly from what's called non-point source pollution. It's not point source. Point source is stacks and pipes. And this was not the case. This is runoff mainly from farm fields.
So it was fertilizer that would be running into the...
Right, this was a prairie landscape at one time, a tall grass prairie landscape, dotted with lakes. And what happened, many of these lakes were drained and ditched, and now over 90% of the landscape in the Minnesota River Basin, which was an originally tall grass prairie, very unique geological area, has been drained and put into industrial agriculture. And when they did that, industrial agriculture, and this was over about 150 years, from about 1850 to the present, especially since World War II. And after World War II, industrial agriculture happened in the basin. And then we got herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, fertilizers, and this propensity for erosion in the basin then, this left the land very easily. And it also created hypoxia. And this is it. I don't know if you heard about the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. There's a dead zone, and the Minnesota River inordinately contributes to that. And so that's one of the reasons that this study that I was part of came about. And this was because the river was polluted and they were looking at ways to clean it up.
Just in a nutshell, how do we contribute way up here? And I'm sure it makes sense, but just in a nutshell, Rich, how does our pollution affect Mexico?
The Gulf of Mexico? Sure.
Gulf.
We are in the Gulf of Mexico watershed. Like in the United Nations, that's what they would say we are. That's our watershed, is the Gulf of Mexico. And the main source of pollution for hypoxia, what happens is that sediment, phosphorus, attaches and binds to sediment. And so when the sediment comes, the phosphorus will bind to it, it floats down, it goes into the river, and then just floats. And keeps going and keeps going, and when it finally settles out, it falls, the phosphorus falls. Algae eat this. The algae bloom. They die. Bacteria eat the algae. We've got hypoxia. So, and hypoxia means a starvation of oxygen for all living creatures in the water. And one of the ways that my study again came about was because Wisconsin got very upset with Minnesota about the amount of pollution going into Lake Pepin. Do you know where Lake Pepin is?
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful lake down in about 40 miles south of here. Well, Wisconsin sued, they filed a potential suit against Minnesota for polluting their half of Lake Pepin. It was like, there's a line actually goes down the middle of that lake.
There is.
Yeah.
Okay.
In government's ideas, there's a line, there's a line. And so Minnesota got involved in trying to reduce this pollution, this phosphorus pollution. The Environmental Protection Agency also got involved, and they said that they would hold this lawsuit up, that they would not encourage it to go through if Minnesota reduced their phosphorus by 20% into the river.
Meaning then our farmers had to really change the way they were fertilizing their
They didn't
crops?
really care how that happened. They just wanted that to happen.
Okay.
And what happened then was Governor Arnie Carlson came about. And Governor Arnie Carlson was our governor at this time. And he started a program. He asked all of his heads of government of all his different agencies to get together, and he formed a citizen advisory committee and had them get together. What he did is he encouraged diverse stakeholders in the basin to start getting together and trying to come up with solutions. And that worked. And Minnesota River Basin Minnesota River and the basin started to experience a decrease in pollution. And that's when my study started about, because what I looked at was something rather unique. Most people who study environmental pollution, they look at the problem area and it's usually getting worse. What I wanted to do was look at a success.
And why was the Minnesota River Valley a success then?
Why was this experiencing a decrease in pollution? It wasn't that the pollution was over, but after 150 years of a continual move towards more and more environmental pollution, it started in about the year 2000, it started to reverse itself. It started to get better. And why was that? And so I asked the question, why did that occur?
And what is your answer, Rich?
Okay. So I can try to put it in a nutshell. Yeah, but, you know, the main thing was a lot of it had to do with what Arne Carlson started. And I used living systems theory to examine this. And this comes out of Gregory Bateson, as you mentioned. Gregory Bateson says the most important thing in understanding in any environmental situation is that human beings are first and foremost embedded within the natural system, that we are part of something greater than ourselves. Human beings strive to control nature. That is,
we're not at the top of the hill, so to speak. We're just on the hill.
Well, no, we're in the hill, more or less.
In the hill, okay.
You want to put it that way,
hill.
because we're embedded. And I always say to people, some people say, "Oh no, we're above nature. You know, we just need better technology, whatever." I usually say, if you don't think that you're an embedded part of nature, all you have to do is close your mouth, plug your nose, and just wait. And you're going to find out that you're a part of nature very quickly. The idea is that in modern Western society is that we have tried to control and dominate nature as being superior, that we felt that our intellects, our human intellects, were superior to nature. And living systems theory and ecology as a whole says that that is not the case, that we are always a part of something greater than ourselves. And so the idea is in living systems theory is that the ecosystem, the prairie ecosystem of which the Minnesota River was part of, is going to heal itself. And those entities within that prairie ecosystem will be encouraged, if you will, by certain components to start making changes that allow that system to heal itself.
Well,
in order for them to survive.
And in your dissertation, I read somewhere that you said that ecosystems will self-correct, will heal themselves, usually without our help. And we're really what's causing things to slide downward. We, man, humankind. So Bateson saw this brilliantly, didn't he? Rich said to me that Bateson was probably equivalent to Einstein. If we think of Einstein understanding the physical world, Bateson would understand the living world in your
his father
language.
Was William Bateson, who's the founder of genetics.
Yes, so what a brilliant family.
He was named after Gregory Mendel. And so the idea was he studied the living world. How does the living world operate? And almost all of the attempts at trying to understand pollution and how environmental pollution occurs or how it is mitigated come from trying to understand it from a physics model, from a non-living world model, impacts, forces, techno-fixes. Bateson said, no, we have to look at ourselves as an embedded part of ecosystems, and how are we not in harmony with the oscillation that ecosystem is trying to self-correct. A good example, he talked about a redwood forest. A redwood forest will self-correct. If there's too much of rain, if there's a lot of rain in one year, well then it'll correct by compensating and doing certain components with it. A good example is a plant. This plant right here. If the sunlight was over here, the plant would actually move towards the sunlight. And its movement would be a sense of locomotion. It would oscillate. It would self-correct. And our bodies are doing that right now. Before it was hot in here. Now we turned the air conditioner on. When it was hot, my body was perspiring. It was doing things to cool me off. Now it's cooler in here. Now it no longer has to do that. This is how living systems work. The Minnesota River Basin is the same idea. That's the whole notion. The Minnesota River Basin is oscillating. It's trying to self-correct from this pollution, which degraded the ecosystem as a whole, inhibited it from its functioning in health, in its ecological health.
So if we would give a grade, Rich, to the Minnesota River in terms of health, 20 years ago, would it be a C, a D, a F, and what would it be today?
Well, it'd be a D, sure, before. An F would be
Okay.
really non-functional, I would say, you know, but
Okay.
kind of a D. But what's happening, there are fish now in the Minnesota River that haven't been there, haven't seen in 20, 30, 40 years. The TMDLs, the total daily maximum loads of different pollutants, are vastly decreased. And part of this has occurred, and a key component of why did this occur, and now going back to Arne Carlson, he did something that was very significant. What he did in living systems theory says this, is what you have to do is you have to enhance communication within the living system from diverse components. And you have to get that diverse communication accentuated as much as possible. And then novel and innovative solutions can come about greater than any of the individual stakeholders within the basin could have come up with on their own. So it isn't. So what the idea is that in my work would look at and say that the correction didn't occur because experts knew something. They had PhD people came up with brilliant ideas and how to do this. When it wasn't local people who had political will or put a lot of money at it. What it was a combination of all these diverse stakeholders getting down together and listening to each other and understanding the ways that they looked at the river differently, because that's a real key component too.
Why do you think this happened with the Minnesota River and it's not happening with all rivers?
And that's really what my dissertation was about. What variables were present in this area? And one was there was an educational component that has been alive here. There are some environmental groups in the basin that have been working for over a decade, 15 years or so, coming up with solutions to particular aspects in their area. Friends of the Minnesota Valley is one, right here in Bloom, right by the Mega Mall. You're just south of the airport, and you know where that is. It's right where the Minnesota comes together right there. There's another one, Clean Up Our River Environment, CURE, which is out in Montevideo, and then CCMR, Coalition for Clean Most River.
Ground swelling.
And what they did is they reframed the river, because when I did some of my research, I asked a farmer one time, I said, I was asking about the river, and he said, I don't know why you care about this Minnesota River. He said, this is our sewer down here. He said, this is where we get rid of our gunk. He said, if I want nature, I'll go up north. I'll go to my cabin in the woods. He said, this is a working river down here. He said, this is where we get rid of our pollution. Okay. Well, I talked to another fellow, and I asked him why he was, who was head of one of these environmental organizations. I said, why are you so strong about returning this sewer, if you will, this working river back to nature, back to a natural state, to the beauty that it once was? And he said, well, I had an experience. He said, when I was a little boy, I went out in the river, and I laid in the river. It was a really hot day, just like a few days ago. And he said, I just innocently went down the river, and I just laid there, he said, in the water. And he said, and I cooled off, but he said, the funniest thing happened. He said, I felt like I was a part of the river. He said, all of a sudden, where I began and where the river started, there wasn't a separation.
So the living system theory in reality,
He got it. And it's really what's called an epistemological change, a way of thinking. Epistemology means a way of knowing, a way of thinking. We're thinking differently about it. Not that nature's out there, not that the river's out there, but that we are a part of it. And this sounds like some like a spiritual or sort of thing like this, but it's very, very pragmatic and very scientific. This is ecology, that we are embedded in a web of life. And that's an ecological idea.
That the American Indians were ahead of us, weren't they, in terms of their thinking like this, don't you think?
Indigenous cultures as a whole, this kind of came about, and people can research this, but it kind of came about 400 years ago with Francis Bacon was one of the people, and Descartes and Isaac Newton, these folks came about, and Francis Bacon said, we want to pull back nature's veil and expose her secrets. Okay, think of that. Okay, look at that metaphor. That the idea wasn't that let's harmonize with the goddess, which was kind of the idea at that time. There was a real strong reaction to some of the extreme religious orientations of the Middle Ages, and to really move towards science and just say that that nature is there to empirically observe, and that our intellect is superior, and that superstition and this type.
And we're separate.
Right.
We're
so really, again, it's this idea of oscillation, that cultures do this as well. They oscillate between ideas. And this whole extreme idea of rejecting nature and not being a part of it you can move back towards one that is in a sense more healthy for that species, for our human species.
What can we do as citizens to help speed up the healing of the Minnesota River, of the St. Croix, of the Mississippi? What are things that as individuals you could
I would say the most
suggest?
important thing is to start thinking differently. There's a book.
An attitudinal shift.
Well, there's a book by a deep ecologist, Arnie Ness. It's called Thinking Like a Mountain. He talked about if you really want to preserve a mountain, what you have to do is you have to think like the mountain. You have to think, what would the mountain want? What would be ideal? Does a mountain want wolves? Maybe that's a good idea for a mountain. And really start thinking differently. And as we think differently, then we can start interacting with life differently. And this is a real transformative type of process that can come on with individuals. That individuals are part of groups. And it's through groups that, and this is living systems theory again, that in living systems theory, there really are no individuals. That there really are, we're all members of groups. We all have different ways, our language, we share a language, we share ideas. And so if you really want to help the basin, start thinking differently and join a group. Get involved with a group of like-minded people, people who have this desire to help clean up something or to restore something, and start working with them. And your ideas, in combination with their ideas, can come up with an idea greater than either one of you or all those people together. And that's the idea of, it's called self-organization or emergence. A novel and creative solution can emerge that takes away the despair that people feel. And the idea that we have to come up with these wonderful solutions. No, we don't. They're waiting to emerge from our interaction.
That's very exciting. And another exciting related idea that you share, and you verbalized it a couple minutes ago, but I just want to come back to it. Out of pain will come solutions in the area of pollution, in the area of life in general. But that is a hopeful approach rather than saying, oh my gosh, we can't do a thing about some of the terrible things going on in terms of pollution and the environment. But out of pain can come growth.
And Gregory Bateson got that from Alcoholics Anonymous. He studied AA. He had field work as an anthropologist on AA.
Now he lived, for those of you who want to look Bateson up,
passed away in
from
1980.
04 to 1980.
Had a
So
centennial, went to a
contemporary.
centennial in Berkeley, and people from all over the world went to there. His books are being republished. There's a revitalization of his thought. His most famous thing probably is he was married to Margaret Mead. It was tough. It was tough for him in that regard. They were divorced.
Two brilliant
Right. Well,
thinkers.
they had different ways of doing things, and he was more ecologically based in that type.
One question I want to also skip back to when I said, what's the Minnesota River Valley now in terms of a grade, Rich? What would you say? Does it get a B?
Well, the main problem with the Minnesota River, and I've written on this as well, is that 90% of the land is industrial agriculture, and they've 100,000 acres is now in permanent easement in riparian buffer strips to filter the pollution that's coming in from the runoff.
That's huge.
But what's happening is industrial agriculture is on the wane. It's waning now, and what has to happen is the basin, they have to come up with ways of living on the land that are economically viable, such as wind generation, this type of thing, sustainable agriculture, and that's what these groups are moving people towards. It's helping farmers move away from a style of agriculture that pollutes and is not economically viable. If it wasn't for the subsidies, farmers wouldn't be in business today. It's the only reason industrial agriculture works.
Long term. So B, C? I'm going to keep asking.
Yeah, I know.
you here.
It's really hard to say because it's probably more of a C to a B.
But
B minus, C plus.
It's come up.
Yes, yeah. You want me to make a tough grade here, all right? Yeah. And the reason for that is that there's much more work to do, but again, it's a reversal. The trend is reversing, and I think that's why I'm hesitant to answer your question directly, because really what I want to talk about is a trend, and that's what to me is really the key focus
Trends are
here.
hard to pinpoint.
150 years of a negative trend, now a positive trend going the other way.
Yeah, it's so nice to have good news here. We have a website that I want to alert you to if you want to get a hold of Rich, if you want to learn more about his thinking and his research, www.livingwebconsulting.com. And we should have mentioned are the president of Living Web Consulting.
And I could say one other final thing about this too is that that what's happening in the Minnesota River Basin is I am working with those groups in terms of a software program that can enable them to have more effective communication between their members and between the different groups. And that'll be a part of my website. You can see that too.
Okay, yeah, that's exciting, and
Yes.
you told me some about it earlier. Well, I've been talking to Richard Currie Smith, who is, as you have gathered, an ecological anthropologist. And this is just fascinating stuff, Rich.
It's been fun. Thank you.
I am excited about the good news that you're bringing, and I hope we can all start thinking more like rivers and like
wonderful.
mountains and like prairie grass.
Yes.
Thank you again
very
for
much.
coming down.
Thank you.
Thank you, too, for being with us. We'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week.